The war had reached its boiling point. By 1942, the Eastern Front had swallowed millions of men and machines, and for the first time, German commanders faced a truth they had never imagined. The Red Army's tanks, once mocked as crude and weak, were now swarming the fields of Russia like steel locusts. The Soviet T-34 had changed the balance of the war. It was fast, deadly, and could shrug off most German anti-tank guns. In Berlin, this realization ignited a familiar obsession to build something bigger, something invincible. And no man embraced that dream more completely than Ferdinand Porsche. Porsche was not a soldier. He was an engineer, brilliant, eccentric, and convinced that mechanical genius could solve any problem. His factory in Stuttgart hummed with the rhythm of innovation. Gearboxes, engines, electric motors, blueprints scattered across drawing tables like battle plans. When Hitler demanded a super tank that could crush the Soviet hordes, Porsche saw his moment. His design would be more than a tank. It would be a fortress on tracks. He called it the Panzerjäger Tiger P, the Tiger Destroyer, later known to history as the Elefant. Weighing nearly 65 tons, it was a beast born from extremes. Its gun, the long-barreled 88mm Pak 43/2/71, could pierce any armor on Earth. At 2,000 meters, it could destroy a T-34 before the Soviet crew even saw the flash. The front plate of the hull was 200 millimeters thick, nearly 8 inches of solid steel. In theory, no Allied weapon could penetrate it. It was, on paper, the most powerful armored vehicle ever built. But the men who would later drive it had a different word for it. They called it the monster. Inside its cavernous hull, the Elefant felt less like a tank and more like a submarine, claustrophobic, mechanical, and suffocating. The driver and radio operator sat in the front, staring through narrow slits of glass, as if peering out from a coffin. Behind them roared the massive Maybach HL-120 engines, underpowered for their burden, overheating after just a few hours of movement. The 88mm gun took up nearly half the interior space. The air stank of oil, cordite, and fear. To Ferdinand Porsche, these were minor details, mere inconveniences on the road to perfection. But to the men who had to fight in them, they were death sentences waiting to happen. In the winter of 1942, as factories across Germany worked around the clock, Porsche's creation rolled off the assembly line. 50 machines in total, each one hand-built, expensive, and over-engineered to the point of absurdity. Hitler himself inspected one during trials and declared, "This is the weapon that will win us the East." It was a promise built on hubris. Because the Elefant's power came at a terrible cost. It was too heavy for most bridges, too slow to maneuver. Its transmission failed constantly. And, in one of the most fatal design oversights in tank warfare, it carried no machine gun, no defense against infantry. Porsche had built the perfect tank destroyer in theory, but he had forgotten one thing. War is not fought on paper. The Elefant's baptism of fire came in July 1943, at the largest tank battle in history, Kursk. The battlefield stretched over 150 miles of rolling Russian farmland, a sea of dust, smoke, and fire. The German army assembled its most fearsome lineup, Tigers, Panthers, and now the new Elefants of Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 653 and 654. Each Elefant was supposed to be unstoppable. Its crews were confident. The enemy would be annihilated long before they came within range. At first, it seemed to work. From their positions on ridgelines, Elefants picked off Soviet tanks with terrifying precision. Their long 88mm cannons punched through T-34s and KV-1s as if they were made of tin. Soviet tankers fled in panic. German commanders radioed back to headquarters, "The Elefant is a triumph." But the triumph didn't last. As the Elefants advanced deeper into the Soviet lines, their weaknesses were exposed. Their weight bogged them down in soft ground. Their engines overheated. Bridges collapsed under them. Many broke down before they even saw combat. Those that did reach the front soon found themselves stranded. Without machine guns, Soviet infantry could approach unseen. Red Army soldiers swarmed the immobilized giants, tossing grenades and Molotov cocktails onto engine decks or climbing onto the hull to drop explosives through the ventilation grates. A German gunner later recalled, "We could destroy everything in front of us, but nothing behind or beside us. We were blind. The Russians hunted us like wolves." By the end of the Battle of Kursk, over half the Elefants were gone, not destroyed by enemy tanks, but by mechanical failure, abandoned, or blown up by their own crews. The so-called invincible machine had proven itself powerful yet helpless, brilliant yet broken. Still, Hitler refused to abandon his dream. The surviving vehicles were recalled to Germany and rebuilt with thicker armor, better optics, and finally, a single machine gun in the hull. They were given a new name to match their imposing silhouette, Elefant. But the myth of invincibility had already begun to crack. In the winter of 1943, as Allied bombers darkened the skies over Europe, the German High Command faced a grim question. Where could such slow, heavy machines still make a difference? The Eastern Front was too vast, the roads too poor. The Elefant needed solid ground, short distances, and, above all, protection from the air. The answer, Hitler believed, lay in Italy. The rugged hills, narrow valleys, and small towns would favor defense. The Elefants could hold mountain passes, ambush Allied armor, and strike fear into the Americans advancing north from Naples. So, in early 1944, 47 surviving Elefants were loaded onto trains and shipped south across the Alps towards a new kind of battlefield, one where the sun was bright, the soil was soft, and the sky was no longer theirs. As the trains wound through tunnels and over bridges, the great beasts of steel groaned under their own weight. Their crews, proud but anxious, watched the Italian countryside pass by. Some still believed they were bringing the Reich's most powerful weapon to a new front. Others, veterans of Kursk, said nothing. They already knew the truth, for in Italy, the Elefant would face an enemy far more dangerous than the Red Army. It would face the sky.
The train that carried the Elefants south groaned like a wounded animal. Its heavy flat cars strained under the weight of 65 tons of steel apiece, each vehicle a monument to Germany's obsession with mechanical supremacy. As the convoys crossed the Alps in late 1943, the men inside the boxcars shivered in the cold, their breath fogging in the dim light. They had survived Kursk, barely. Now they were being sent to a new front, one that was supposed to offer redemption: Italy. To Hitler and his generals, Italy was an opportunity, a natural fortress where German forces could believe the Allies dry. The rugged Apennines, narrow passes, and winding roads favored defense. And yet, buried in that optimism was a deadly flaw: the assumption that the war would still be decided on the ground. The men of Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 653 didn't yet realize that their true enemy wasn't waiting ahead in the hills of Italy. It was already above them, somewhere in the clouds, wearing white stars on silver wings. When the Elefants arrived near Anzio in early 1944, the front was chaos. American and British troops had landed on the beaches in January, hoping to outflank the German Gustav Line and march toward Rome. But the Germans had recovered quickly. The battlefield had stagnated into a brutal stalemate: mud, shellfire, and constant artillery duels. At first, the Elefants were seen as godsends. German infantry cheered when they saw them roll into position. Their sheer presence boosted morale. Massive hulls glinting under the Italian sun, their 88mm guns like spears of judgment. The soldiers whispered that these were the invincible tanks from Russia, the ones that could stop anything. But Italy was no place for giants. The Elefant was never meant for mountain roads. Its enormous weight shattered bridges. Its narrow tracks sank into soft earth. It consumed fuel faster than any supply truck could deliver. To move one Elefant a single kilometer sometimes required hours of repair and coordination. Worse still, it was slow, painfully, hopelessly slow. Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted their movements days before they arrived. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Schober, a driver in the 653rd Battalion, later remembered, "We would advance 20 kilometers, then spend the night repairing what broke during the day. The roads were too narrow, the bridges too weak. The machine hated the country, and the country hated the machine." The Germans tried to hide them under camouflage nets, in barns, or between olive groves. But every time they moved, they left deep scars in the soil, long black trails of oil and crushed stone that led straight to their positions. And above, American pilots were watching. The first encounters between Elefants and Allied forces in Italy revealed everything wrong with the German strategy. In April 1944, near the town of Nettuno, 2 Elefants attempted to reposition under cover of darkness. Rain had turned the ground into soup. Both vehicles became bogged down. The crews tried to free them, but the noise of the engines drew artillery fire. When dawn broke, they were still stuck, and Allied air patrols were already in the sky. P-40 Warhawks and Spitfires appeared first, strafing with machine guns and rockets. The armor held. The thick frontal plates deflected everything. The crews, emboldened, fired back with their 88mm guns, uselessly blazing at targets that vanished into the sun. Then came the P-47 Thunderbolts. The American fighter bombers didn't die from the front. They came from above and behind, from where the Elefant was weakest. Each one carried 2 500-pound bombs or a salvo of high-velocity rockets. When the first bombs struck, they didn't penetrate the armor. They didn't have to. The concussion shattered tracks, caved in hatches, and ruptured the engine decks. The second wave finished the job. One Elefant exploded, its ammunition igniting in a fountain of flame. The other burned for hours before its crew abandoned it. By noon, the great invincible tanks were nothing more than smoldering wrecks. The German command tried to adjust. They ordered Elefants to operate only at night or from concealed ambushes. But the war was changing faster than any doctrine could adapt. American air dominance was now absolute. Every road, every column, every whisper of movement could be answered by bombs within minutes. And unlike the vast plains of Russia, Italy offered no place to hide. Even when Elefants tried to use towns for cover, the Thunderbolts came anyway. They would circle high above until a glint of sunlight betrayed a tank's position, then dive, engines howling, the ground trembling beneath their wings. The P-47s were not delicate machines. They were brawlers of the sky. With their .850 caliber machine guns, they could strip the paint off a tank from a mile away. And their pilots, hardened by years of combat, had learned something vital. A tank's greatest armor meant nothing if you hit it where it couldn't look. The engine deck, the ventilation grates, the rear armor, all were weak points. And the Elefant, for all its grandeur, had them in abundance. By May 1944, as German forces retreated towards Cisterna di Latina, the myth of the Elefant was crumbling. The survivors limped along roads littered with burned-out vehicles, their crews exhausted and grim. They still believed in their machine's gun, its unmatched range, its killing power, but they had stopped believing it could save them. They no longer feared the Sherman or the Churchill. They feared the shadows that passed overhead. One German commander wrote in his journal, "We have the strongest tank in the world, but it is blind to the sky. The Americans do not fight us, they hunt us." For the Luftwaffe, it was an embarrassment. For the Panzer divisions, it was a nightmare. And for the men inside the Elefants, engineers' dreams turned into iron coffins, it was the beginning of the end. At the same time, the Americans were refining a deadly new skill, close air support. What had begun as improvised coordination between ground units and air squadrons was becoming a science. Spotter planes marked targets, radio operators guided attacks, Within minutes, P-47s could be overhead, diving from 10,000 feet to deliver pinpoint strikes. To the Germans, it looked like magic. To the Americans, it was the future. And that future would reveal itself in full fury in just a few days, in a quiet stretch of farmland near Cisterna, when the sky itself would decide the fate of the Elefant. As dusk settled over the Italian countryside, the surviving Elefants of the 653rd Battalion rumbled into position for redeployment. The crews cleaned their guns, checked their engines, and stared upward at the fading sky. In the silence between artillery barrages, one mechanic whispered, "It's not the enemy we can see that kills us anymore." He was right, because the next morning, the Elefants would meet their end not in a duel, not in a blaze of tank fire, but under the shadow of American wings. And for the first time in history, air power would prove that no armor was safe from the sky.
The morning sun over Cisterna di Latina rose into a pale Italian sky, hazed by dust and the faint residue of war. The fields were still wet from spring rain, and the roads shimmered like bronze ribbons stretching toward the distant hills. Along one of those roads, the ground trembled under a deep metallic rhythm. 6 Elefants of Schwer Panzerjäger Abteilung 653, lumbering east to reinforce a battered defensive line. Their engines growled like wounded beasts. The men inside were silent, exhausted, and wary. They had survived Kursk. They had survived Anzio. Now ordered to move across open terrain in broad daylight, they could only hope that the sky, that endless, merciless sky, would ignore them for just one more hour. It would not. At 10:43 a.m., high above the Lazio plains, a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 27th Fighter Bomber Group broke through the cloud layer. Each aircraft carried 2 500-pound bombs, a rack of high-velocity rockets, and the firepower of 8 50-caliber machine guns. Their mission was routine: patrol for German troop movements south of Rome. But as they banked over Cisterna, sunlight flashed off something below, a gleam of steel, half hidden among olive groves. "Multiple bogies on the road," came the call over the radio. "Big ones, moving slow." Captain Richard "Red" Barton squinted through his canopy. From 9,000 feet, he saw them. Massive, boxy silhouettes crawling along the dirt road, throwing long shadows in the morning light. He had never seen tanks so large. Jesus, they looked like battleships. To the German crews below, the faint roar of engines above the clouds was the sound they dreaded most. Every man in those Elefants knew what was coming. There was no cover, no Luftwaffe escort, no chance to hide. Lieutenant Franz Neumann, commander of the lead vehicle, slammed the hatch shut and shouted to his driver, "Keep moving, don't stop, maybe they'll miss us." But speed meant nothing to a tank that could barely crawl. At 10:51, the Thunderbolts began their dive. The first pair dropped through the clouds in a screaming descent, their engines howling like thunder. The ground rushed upward. The pilots flipped their arming switches, steadied their aim, and released. 2 500-pound bombs fell from Barton's plane, tumbling end over end before striking the earth beside the convoy. The explosion lifted dirt and fire 100 feet into the air. The blast wave flipped a German half-track and showered the lead Elefant in mud and shrapnel. The second wave came in lower, firing rockets. White smoke trails streaked across the sky. One rocket slammed directly into the rear engine deck of the second Elefant. There was a flash of orange, then a roar that tore the tank apart. From inside the surviving vehicles, men screamed over the roar of their engines. "Get out! Get out!" But there was nowhere to go. At 11 o'clock, The third wave hit. 4 P-47s came in at treetop level, guns blazing. The chatter of 50 caliber rounds tore through the air like a chainsaw. The Elefant's armor could stop a shell, but not the delicate machinery that kept them alive. The rounds shredded fuel lines, perforated radiators, and burst open ammunition bins. One of the German gunners fired his 88mm cannon blindly into the sky. The recoil rocked the vehicle, but his shell disappeared uselessly into the clouds. He reloaded once, and then his world became flame. A direct bomb hit detonated the ammunition stowage. The Elefant exploded like a volcano, its turretless hull splitting open. Chunks of armor the size of doors rained across the field. A Thunderbolt pilot watching from above radioed in disbelief. "Scratch one heavy. God almighty, she blew like a battleship." For the men and the remaining Elefants, panic replaced discipline. 2 tried to turn off the road, but the mud caught their treads. One bogged down in a ditch, the other spun its tracks helplessly. The drivers revved their engines, praying the massive machines would move, but they only sank deeper. By 11:15, the fourth attack run began. Rockets screamed down, slamming into engine decks and maintenance hatches. One Elefant caught fire from the rear, flames licking up through the grates, as the crew bailed out, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from above. Captain Barton's flight made one final pass, strafing the column until only smoke and twisted metal remained. Then he pulled up, leveling his aircraft at 4,000 feet. All targets destroyed, not a single one fired back. When the smoke cleared, the road was a graveyard. 5 Elefants burned furiously, their 88mm guns pointing uselessly at the sky. The 6th sat silent, blackened, its tracks broken. Inside, Lieutenant Neumann and his driver lay dead, killed by concussion. The smell of fuel, fire, and cordite hung heavy over the Italian fields. An American reconnaissance jeep arrived hours later. Its driver climbed from the vehicle and stared at the wrecks, astonished. "What the hell are these things?" he whispered. One of the soldiers kicked a chunk of armor that had fallen from a destroyed Elefant. It rang like a bell, 2 inches thick, and still it hadn't mattered. The tank that had terrorized Soviet crews at Kursk, that had been hailed as the pinnacle of German engineering, had been wiped from the earth in 15 minutes, not by other tanks, not by artillery, but by planes built in factories 5,000 miles away. For the Americans, the battle was a revelation. The P-47 had long been known as a workhorse, a tough, rugged fighter that could take punishment and deliver it in kind. But at Cisterna, it proved something new, that air power could annihilate armor. The Thunderbolt's speed, altitude, and precision gave it a reach that no tank could answer. And it wasn't just the bombs or rockets that killed the Elefants. It was the doctrine, the coordination, the communication, the sheer industrial muscle that put a dozen planes over any road, anytime, anywhere. For the Germans, Cisterna was a nightmare made real. Reports from the battlefield reached headquarters the next day. One officer summarized them bluntly. "Our strongest tanks were destroyed without returning fire. The Americans now own the air and therefore the earth." It was a turning point, not just for the Elefant, but for armored warfare itself. The days when steel monsters could rule the battlefield were ending. The sky had become the new high ground. In the days after the battle, Allied soldiers moved through the wreckage. They examined the ruins, measured the armor, and marveled at the engineering. One British officer wrote in his notebook, "Magnificent construction, utterly useless."
Of the 6 elephants destroyed near Cisterna, none were recovered. The wrecks were too heavy to move. They were simply left to rust, black silhouettes on the Italian soil. Reminders that power without adaptability is a death sentence. And in the quiet that followed, as the smoke drifted eastward and the Thunderbolts vanished into the horizon, the age of the heavy tank died. The Elefant, the so-called invincible beast of Kursk, had met its end not on the ground, but in the sky. It never fired a meaningful shot. It never even saw its killers. And in that silence, history recorded a new truth. The day the Elefant faced American air power, it lost without firing a shot.
The ruins of Cisterna smoldered for days. Black plumes twisted into the Italian sky like the ghosts of fallen titans. Local farmers crept out from their homes after the bombing stopped, staring at the carcasses of the German monsters that had once terrorized the countryside. What they saw were not machines of triumph, but hulks of melted steel, their tracks torn away, their guns bent like paper, their armor blistered and useless. For the Allies, the battle was a spectacle of modern war. For Germany, it was a revelation they could not afford to accept. The myth of the invincible tank was dead. News of the destruction reached the German high command within days. The field report from Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 653 was concise and grim. 6 elephants destroyed by aerial attack. No enemy armor engaged. Total loss. To the generals in Berlin, it was an insult to everything they believed in. Since 1940, the German army had built its identity on the supremacy of steel, the idea that superior engineering could overcome any number of enemies. The Panzer was the symbol of blitzkrieg, the weapon that had crushed Poland, France, and half of Europe. But now, in Italy, it had been humbled, not by better tanks, but by airplanes. Even worse, those airplanes were not elite or rare. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the machine that had annihilated the Elefants, was one of tens of thousands. The Americans were producing them faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. What the Elefants' destruction revealed was not just the vulnerability of German armor, it exposed the collapse of the entire German war doctrine. By the summer of 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever German tanks appeared, Allied aircraft followed. In France, during the Normandy campaign, Tiger tanks were picked off one by rocket-firing Typhoons and Thunderbolts. In Poland, the Red Air Force's IL-2 Sturmowics turned Panther columns into smoking wrecks. On every front, the sky had become a death sentence for the giants of Germany's armored divisions. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was gone. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons, pilots were being trained in weeks instead of years. The few fighters that reached the sky faced swarms of Allied aircraft that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. German tank commanders began to dread the sunlight. One recalled bitterly, "We ruled the ground, but the Americans ruled the sky, and the sky decides everything." For the men inside the Elefants, the psychological toll was devastating. They had once been the elite, crews chosen for their skill, entrusted with the Reich's most powerful weapon. But after Cisterna, they understood their fate. They could fight Shermans, they could face Churchills, but against the P-47, they were helpless. Veterans of the 653rd Battalion remembered the transformation vividly. In Russia, we feared the T-34. In Italy, we feared the silence before the dive. The roar of the P-47 Thunderbolts engine had become the sound of doom. They learned to freeze at the faintest echo from above, to scatter from their own machines, to dig into the earth like frightened men instead of armored warriors. Even the tank itself became a prison. The same armor that had once promised safety now trapped its crew inside a tomb of steel when the bombs fell. After Cisterna, the surviving Elefants were withdrawn from the front lines. There were fewer than 20 still operational.
Some were reassigned to defend bridges and passes north of Rome, others sent to the rear as static bunkers. But the war had moved on. The Elephant was obsolete before it even fired another shot. When Rome fell in June 1944, the Germans began their long retreat north. The Elephants couldn't keep up. They were abandoned one by one along the roads, too heavy to recover, too precious to destroy quickly. Allied soldiers would find them days later, engines cold, tracks snapped, crews gone. In some, blood still stained the crew hatches. In others, the logs of the last battle remained open, half burned, ending in words that said everything. Enemy planes above, we cannot move. Meanwhile, across the continent, the Allies were mastering the art of combined warfare. For the Americans, Cisterna had been proof of concept, a demonstration that air-ground coordination could destroy even the strongest enemy units. The Air Force developed new tactics, forward observers with radios, communication between pilots and tank columns, faster reaction times. It was the beginning of modern close air support, a revolution that would define every war to come. In the factories back home, America's industrial heart beat with a rhythm that no German engineer could match. While Porsche's assembly lines struggled to repair one Elefant, American workers in Detroit, Cleveland, and Long Island rolled out hundreds of P-47s, Shermans, and half-tracks every week. The balance of war had shifted from innovation to production, from brilliance to scale. By 1945, the age of the armored giants was over. Germany still built monstrous machines, the Tiger II, the Jager Tiger, and the Maus, but they were relics before they even reached the front lines. They consumed fuel that didn't exist, required crews that couldn't be spared, and faced enemies who no longer fought on equal terms. The Elephant's descendants were slower, heavier, and just as doomed. A German engineer working at Nibelungenwerk, one of the factories that built heavy tanks, summed it up in a letter never meant for publication. "We are making weapons for a world that no longer exists. The sky has replaced the battlefield." When the war finally ended, only 2 Elephants remained intact, one captured by the Soviets, another by the Americans. Both were hauled away to be studied, photographed, and eventually displayed. In those silent museums, visitors would stand before the hulking shape of Porsche's masterpiece and marvel at its size. Children would stare at the thick plates of armor and ask the same question their fathers once had. How could anything destroy this? The answer was written in the burn marks on its roof, small circular scars where rockets had struck home. In the final days of the Reich, as Berlin burned and the once proud panzers lay scattered across Europe, a bitter irony became clear. The Germans believed that perfection in engineering could win wars, that if they could just build something strong enough, clever enough, invincible enough, the world would kneel before it. But the war was not decided by perfection, it was decided by production, by adaptation, by the ability to command the third dimension, the air. And in that new dimension, the Elephant had no place. In Italy, where the battle began, the wrecks of Cisterna were never recovered. The earth swallowed them over time, hulks half buried in grass and soil, their guns still pointing skyward as if in accusation. Farmers plowed around them, their children played on them, and the steel rusted away beneath the sun. Only one inscription remained legible on the side of an abandoned hull, scratched by some unknown soldier before the end. "We were strong, but not enough." The fall of the Elephant was more than a military defeat. It was a symbol of the end of an age, the moment when man's faith in the power of armor gave way to the dominion of the air. The giants had fallen, and in their ashes arose a new truth. No matter how thick the armor, the sky always wins.
The fields around Cisterna are quiet now. Olive trees have grown where the road once thundered under the weight of steel, and the grass hides the scars left by fire and blast. But beneath the soil lie the bones of an empire's ambition, what remains of the Elefants that burned there in May 1944. The sky that doomed them is just as blue today, calm and endless, unaware that it once decided the fate of the earth below. The Battle of Cisterna was not a great campaign or a turning point in maps. It was something subtler and far more significant. The day the world learned that armor, no matter how thick, could not outlast the sky. In the decades since, historians have often described the Elefant as a marvel of engineering trapped in the wrong era, a weapon designed for a battlefield that no longer existed. It was the culmination of a philosophy that had defined Germany's war machine: perfection over practicality, power over adaptability. The Elefant represented everything the Third Reich believed about itself: unstoppable, invincible, forged by genius. Yet it was undone not by a superior tank or a clever general, but by the simple reality of modern warfare. Whoever controlled the air controlled the outcome. At Cisterna, the Luftwaffe was absent. The Elefants had no cover, no warning, and no escape. The Americans didn't need to outthink them. They only needed to find them. In the archives of the 27th Fighter Bomber Group, the mission report for May 26, 1944, remains matter of fact. 6 enemy armored vehicles sighted near Cisterna, engaged with bombs and rockets. Results: 6 destroyed. Own losses: none. No mention of the men inside those burning halls. No note about what those machines had meant to the enemy who built them. Just a tally: 6 more entries in the ledger of a war that had become industrial, mechanical, and merciless. That cold efficiency was exactly what Ferdinand Porsche could never understand. His Elefant was a masterpiece of design, every bolt and plate handcrafted. It took months to build each one, while the Americans were rolling P-47s and Shermans off assembly lines by the hundreds every week. Porsche had built the perfect Predator for 1941, but it was 1944 now, and the world had moved on. The men who survived the Elefants campaign in Italy never forgot what they witnessed. One former gunner from Abteilung 653, interviewed years after the war, said quietly, "We had faith in our machine. It could destroy any tank, but it could not look up. When the planes came, it was like fighting ghosts. You could hear them, feel them, but never touch them." Another, who had escaped his burning vehicle near Cisterna, spoke of a different realization. "When we burned, no one came to help us. The war had left us behind. The sky had become the true battlefield." For them, the Elefant wasn't just a machine. It was the coffin of an idea, the last breath of the armored myth that had carried Germany across Europe. In the years that followed, armies around the world took the lesson of Cisterna to heart. Tanks didn't vanish, but they evolved. They grew lighter, faster, more flexible. Anti-aircraft cover became a necessity, not an afterthought. Radar and air reconnaissance became as crucial as armor thickness. The age of lumbering giants gave way to an era of integration, where no tank fought alone, and every movement was shadowed by the power of the air. When American and Soviet engineers later designed the great Cold War machines, the M48 Patton, the T-62, the Leopard, they remembered the Elefant. They remembered that protection meant nothing without coordination, and that even the strongest armor was just a tomb if the sky belonged to the enemy. Today, only 2 Elefants survive. One sits at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, its paint faded, its interior blackened by fire. The other rests in the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia. Its enormous hull towers over visitors, silent and still, a monument to both genius and failure. If you stand beside it, you can still trace the scars left by rockets, shallow depressions in the armor where the metal bubbled and burned. The engineers who restored it deliberately left them untouched. They are history's handwriting, reminders of the day when might and arrogance met the reality of progress. A small plaque beneath the vehicle reads, "Captured near Cisterna, Italy, May 1944. Destroyed by air attack. Recovered by U.S. forces. Tourists take photos. Children marvel at its size. But few grasp what it truly represents. This was not just a tank. It was an idea. And that idea died in the open fields of Italy. The story of the Elephant is not just about defeat. It is about transformation. For centuries, war was fought in two dimensions, armies clashing across land and sea. The Elephant was born into that world, built for domination across the horizontal plane. But by 1944, war had expanded upward. The sky had become a third dimension of control, and the Elephant, bound to the ground by its own weight, could not follow. Its destruction marked the birth of the modern battlefield, one where victory would depend on integration, mobility, and the invisible reach of the air. One of the American pilots who flew that day at Cisterna, Captain Richard "Red" Barton, was interviewed in 1983. When asked if he remembered the battle, he paused for a long time before replying, "I remember the fire. I remember how the bombs lit up the fields. I remember thinking, we're not fighting men anymore. We're fighting machines. And those poor devils inside, they never had a chance." He looked down, then added softly, "They built something nothing on earth could kill. So we came from the sky." 80 years later, that sentence still captures the essence of the lesson. The Elephant was not destroyed by weakness, but by evolution. It represented the last stand of an age where armor meant safety and firepower meant dominance. Cisterna proved that neither mattered when you no longer controlled the heavens. That truth reshaped every army, every doctrine, every war that followed. It still echoes today, in the hum of drones, in the precision of missiles, in the simple fact that soldiers on the ground now fight beneath a sky that can see everything. The ghosts of the Elephants still lie beneath the soil of Italy, buried beneath layers of time and silence. Their rusting hulks remind us that no machine, no empire, no belief in invincibility can stand against the relentless advance of innovation. Because, in the end, it was not the gun that decided the battle, not the armor, not the courage of the men inside. It was the sky.